The Enlightenment is a natural forum for comedy, with its endless critiques and saying, well, let's just take another look at that. Let's take another look at this. Have you really thought about this? Have you really thought this through? And why do people do it this way or that way or whatever? This is what comedy does on a regular basis. It is applying common sense to the absurd traditions and the absurd world we find ourselves in. So when a character like Voltaire comes along, he is the man in the moment. He writes an awful lot. He is a very productive writer on a variety of topics in a number of different forums. He writes a lot of letters. He's the great enlightened despots of the age. He writes plays. He writes essays. He writes a lot. But Candide is what we know him for. Candide is what generally lives from Voltaire. And that's not a bad legacy to have. It is a fantastic book. It is relatively short. It is hysterically funny. It raises a lot of good points. And it's relatively easy to read in the span of a couple of days, or even a couple of hours, depending on how fast you read. It is the absurd little story of a young man from provincial Germany, Westphalia. Voltaire critiques an awful lot in this. Voltaire has many, many targets. The primary one, the most hysterical one, is his belief or the prevailing philosophy of what is generally characterized as optimism. If you read your footnotes, you find out that he is critiquing a man named Leibniz, who fosters an idea that we live in the best possible world. But Voltaire is just looking around and saying, well, really? This is it? He is specifically outraged following a very famous and devastating earthquake in Portugal, which he portrays in Candide, after which he writes a poem, a very powerful poem, but it's only a little later that he sits down and he writes Candide from a different perspective. It's less condemning, it's less dramatic, it is funnier. And the tool of humor is what brings it its life. The earthquake is just one sequence in a number of them. The story itself is rather absurd, and that's kind of the point. The character Candide goes from this young man living in this little provincial town and thinking, oh, he lives in the greatest place ever. And he goes through a series of ridiculous, highly improbable episodes, adventures, and in the end comes to realize that, well, maybe what I thought isn't quite accurate. In this way, it's sort of straddling the lines of what it means to be a novel. The novel is still coming about at this age. Long-form narrative is in prose is still an evolving thing, but this is really the era that is giving it its push. The episodic nature of the story, of the plot, gives you a sense of what the novel is moving away from. But the fact that the character changes in the end, his viewpoint evolves, let's say, this is a sign of where the novel is going. The idea that is the story of one person and their perspective on the world somehow changes in the end. And it is that change is a product of the events that lead up to it. It's a complicated little fit within the history of the evolution of narrative for that. But for what it is, it's fun. If the story was realistic, it might be too sad because it is so ridiculous, because the episodes are so one on top of the other and so wildly coincidental and improbable. that makes you push back at it a little and say, well, okay, this is all silly. It's fun, but it's through the humor that we can really start to think about things, because you want to engage with this story. It's too much fun to just put away. You can put away a sad poem and say, well, I don't really feel like getting bummed out right now, so I'm not going to dwell on that. It's too bad for the people in Portugal. I feel bad for them, but, you know, I got things to do. But Candide is fun. You want to go along with it. And along the way, in between all of those jokes, and there are a lot of jokes, between all of that, you're getting these little moments that jump out at you and say, well, now, wait a minute. Best of all possible worlds? Is it really that bad? One after the other after the other. The principal figure, the principal exponent of the best of all possible worlds philosophy, the stand-in for Dr. Leibniz, would be this character, Pangloss. Pangloss is the resident philosopher in this rinky-dink little town and is part of the entourage of the Baron Thunder Ten Trunk. Germany's carved up into lots of little principalities and lots of big fish in tiny ponds, and this one is organized around this one. But Pangloss is so convinced that everything is the way it's supposed to be, and God is good, so God created a good world, and everything is perfect. It is a proposition that screams out for some pushback. But Pangloss is up to the challenge. Pangloss has no problem stitching together his reality in such a way that it makes his point for him. Never more hysterically so when he explains. Pangloss explains the evils in the world through the experience of Christopher Columbus and the exploration of the Americas. Not at all, replied the great man, Pangloss. It's an indispensable part of the best of worlds, a necessary ingredient. If Columbus had not caught on an American island this sickness, syphilis, which attacks the source of generation and sometimes prevents generation entirely, which thus strikes at and defeats the greatest end of nature herself, we should have neither chocolate nor cochineal. Cochineal is a dye, chocolate is, well, chocolate, and of course, evils in the world, the pain and suffering that Columbus brought to the Americas. The sailors in Columbus infected a lot of the people over in what were the Indies, as they called them, and it led to a lot of suffering. Syphilis was rampant, and Pangloss just takes that ball and says, well, of course, syphilis must be good. The best of all possible worlds must include syphilis, because without it, we would not have chocolate. You know, I like chocolate too. I don't know if I would make that equation. Again and again and again, you get these little things that just make you push back. You don't need a particularly advanced understanding of philosophy. The crazy, illogical pattern of events, the sequence of them, the rapid fire disaster after disaster after disaster of it, paints a world that is far, far from the best of all possible worlds, and in fact raises the question, but certainly doesn't make it explicit, raises the question of whether or not, did God have any hand in this world at all? Voltaire is coming down on the side generally of the deists of the age, where they believe in the watchmaker God, who was there at the moment of creation, set the laws of nature in place, wound up the world like a watch, and then walked away. And all of the activity of the church, all of the ritual, all of the prayers, all of the belief of God coming and interceding in human life and caring in any way, shape, or form what happens down here, or ordering life in any way, is absurd. So religious leaders, religious characters, religious authorities are one after the other just despicable people. There are repeatedly vows of chastity being broken, vows of poverty being broken, basic ethics being violated. There is no such thing as piety in Voltaire's world. If you are a member of the church authority, you are generally just a scoundrel and a scam artist. One of my favorite characters, perhaps one of the great characters in all literature, is the old woman. Candide is on the run with Pangloss. They hook up with this old woman who is taking care of Cunegonde, the love of Candide's life. And they're all complaining. He's like, oh, have we ever had any problems? Have we ever had any, has anybody ever suffered as much as we have? And the old woman just shoots that down and says, have you ever really suffered? Because let me tell you my story. And we get her story. And we get stories throughout Candide. Different people telling different stories of suffering, of misery. And the recurrent effect of all this, like, well, yeah, everybody's just miserable. They have horrible, horrible lives. So as we are tracking Candide's unfortunate life, we get him being told of other people with other unfortunate lives. Misery is universal. And she tells this story of how she has been raped and just left for dead, and she was born she was born of a pope, but not necessarily a real pope. They give a name, but it's not a real one. But still, it's a bold move for Voltaire. She was very young and very beautiful, and she herself is, she ends up like just destitute. At one point she is lying on a pile of dead bodies, just hoping that she will be passed over and allowed to either die or just suffer alone so that she won't be raped anymore. And she's lying on a pile of dead bodies, and some guy comes crawling along and looks down at her. The entire book is written in Voltaire's French. We get a nice little splash of Italian in there. Oh, che sciagura d'essere senza coglione! Which the footnotes will tell you, oh, what a shame to be without testicles. Because coming across a bloody, wounded young woman lying on a pile of fetid corpses, it's a shame that he can't rape her too. But he is a castrati who had been castrated in youth so that he would be able to sing the high notes. It's a fun little moment. Again, showing a very dark side of humanity in a rather funny, lighthearted way. Take that as you will. There is an awful lot of raping going on in this, and, you know, there's certainly room to be offended by that. But I think the cumulative effect is that rape is just one more tragedy that happens in life and that people have to go on for. And the old woman does go on, and she survives, and she gets taken prisoner, she gets swapped, she gets tortured. At one point, she has one of her buttocks, half of her butt, sliced off so that it can be eaten by her captors. and this little fact that she only has one buttock, Voltaire handles beautifully, because he drops it throughout her appearances before she even starts telling the story. You know, when she says, well, yeah, I'm going to have trouble sitting on a horse because I've only got one buttock. And that is just left there. And Voltaire goes on with the rest of his story. And the reader is just sitting there like, excuse me, did I read that right? But when it finally gets to it, you realize, oh, because it was sliced off to feed some hungry soldiers. You know, it's funny. Just one buttock. I love that little detail. But she says one of the great lines in the entire book when she comes out with, after telling this long story, it's the longest of the suffering stories that we get in here. She says, 100 times I wanted to kill myself, but always I loved life more. Life force, humanity itself. Logically, why not kill yourself? It makes perfect sense. We have the ability to reason, and at a certain point, when our misery outpaces any joy that we have in our lives, it simply makes sense. Oh, well, you know, well, just kill myself, and then that will balance the scales a little bit more. It's silly to pursue this life that is just such unending torture for me. So that's the reasonable thing to do. But she couldn't do it because something stopped her. Always I loved life more. Human nature won't let go. Human nature doesn't really care about the reason. Human nature doesn't care about the abstract calculations that you might make about your misery index. Human nature lives, no matter how much you can't reason with it. She is a great character, and she's fun, and she is a voice of common sense throughout. And Voltaire will lean on different people for different kinds of common sense, different characters. But it's always a sense of there are people with extreme views, there are people with hysterically wrong views, there are people with conflicting views. Pangloss will eventually get balanced off by another friend that he picks up in his adventures, and gives a sense of there are opposites, there are polarities in life, there are polarities in thought, and that for everybody who thinks that this is the best of all possible worlds, there's going to be somebody who says, yeah, but there's this is actually the worst of all possible worlds. How do you deal with those two perspectives? How do you find a balance between them? Can you find a balance between them? What do you do with them? Can you reject one and go with the other? This story is constantly turning over these questions to show you another perspective. At a certain point, Cunegonde, Candide, and the old woman have to escape. Pangloss is killed, he is hung. Candide narrowly escapes death and ends up killing someone, killing two people actually, a priest and a Jew who had been trading sexual favors or trading off on raping, essentially, you could say, Cunegonde. Doesn't matter, different faiths, different identities, they're all just terrible, and her life is not going quite so well as the best of all possible worlds would seem to make it, and she's also starting to show herself to be not quite the angelic figure that Candide clings to, this image of this perfect, beautiful, virginal girl. That image gets some wear and tear in pretty quick succession. But anyway, they go to the New World. They get shipped off to America. They find themselves in South America, and they're trying to essentially escape the law. They have a bunch of adventures there. Candide goes through. Voltaire uses the example of the Americas as a contrast to European civilization. So when they come across a mysterious civilization within the jungle, it's El Dorado. It's the perfect world. It is the perfect world. They find rocks, kids playing with rocks in the street, and they look at them, and they're actually gold and priceless gems. And the kids just sort of toss them away. It's like, yeah, this is nothing. And Candide and his friend are going, hey, can we have some of those? You don't like your pebbles? Well, we'll take them. At one point, he's wandering along. He comes across a slave, and he sees the slave has lost like an arm and a leg, just cut off. And he's just lying there on the side of the road. He asks them, what's the problem? What happened to this? And he says, well, this is the cost of sugar. He was a runaway slave or something like that, or he spoke back, or somehow he bucked the slave system a little bit. He rebelled against it in some form, and he was punished. He was punished once by losing a leg, a second time for another infraction by losing an arm, and it is this draconian punishment system that is clearly being brought out for something so simple as sugar. Just so Europeans can have a little sugar in their coffee or their tea. Is that really the cost? Do we want to think about it? How many people like to think about that thing, even today? How many electronics are made with questionable labor practices around the world? The moral hazard is very obvious here. And Candide is just moving through this world saying, this is awkward, this is uncomfortable. And it's endlessly funny for the deadpan quality of the humor, but it's savage in its criticism, because one after the other, all of Candide's illusions get stripped away. He clings to them, and every time he says, but Dr. Pangloss would say this is the best of all possible worlds, it sounds more hollow to the reader, because the repetition, the reader gets to the conclusion way before Candide, and at a certain point you're just sitting there with Voltaire laughing at this doofus who's clinging to this ridiculous ideal, and you're waiting for him to pick up. And Candide here is, in many ways, the stand-in for all humanity. And it's flattering to the reader to be put in the position of judging all humanity. But that also implies a certain responsibility, doesn't it? Doesn't it suggest that, well, if you can criticize, if you can see the right way to do things, why do you cling to old ways yourself? Why do you mix sugar in with your coffee and your tea when you know where it might be coming from and what the cost is? Little things like this that is very uncomfortable for a reader to sit there and, I like passing judgment on other people, but the inevitable conclusion reflects back on me. And that's awkward. That's uncomfortable. The safety of this is from the distance. That humor is about distance. When he first wrote about the earthquake, it was realistic and somewhat grim. But when he got away from the system, when he got away from the tragedy of it, he was able to find the humor. And it's the humor that he uses as the mechanism for criticism. And this is really why it is both a quintessentially Enlightenment piece and post-Enlightenment piece, because it shows he is thinking about these things. He is critiquing them from a point of reasonability, but he is at the same time undermining the whole notion of reason and abstract thought at the same time. Enlightenment is criticism, and criticism is endless, because you critique something, and then your critique is open to a critique, which becomes open to yet another critique in multiple ways. It mushrooms out very, very quickly. Where do you put your foot down? Where do you find a home base, let's say? Well, Voltaire makes a suggestion towards the end, or at the end of the book. After bouncing through Europe, after bouncing through America, he finds his way back through Europe, passes by England, goes through France and Italy, and ends up in Istanbul, Turkey, Constantinople as it is known then, which is a curious little location. You can see how it's historically been a nether point between Europe and Asia. It's that little linchpin. It is a kind of liminal space between two other masses. So he is finding a place between, which is significant. And having hooked back up with Cunigund, the love of his life, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, is now a fairly old and ugly woman. But he has promised to marry her, and so he goes through with it. Less thrilled than perhaps he was just a few years earlier. He has some money, having taken some out of El Dorado. There's a whole long sequence about that. But he is also hooked back up with not only the friends he has made along the way, his friend Martin, the scholar, who's very pessimistic, but also the yin to Martin's yang. Pangloss is back. Pangloss, turns out, didn't so much die then, even though he was hung. People die and come back from the dead a couple of times in this book, and it's all pretty ridiculous. But again, that's kind of the idea. But they find themselves back in Istanbul, and they go to see a holy man of sorts. Just about the only holy man that doesn't come in for great castigation here. And Candide is struggling with this. You know, what's the right approach? Is this the best of all possible worlds? Is this the worst of all possible worlds? Optimism, skepticism. What's the right way? And Candide is basically told, you know, what are you kidding? What are you, an idiot? Don't worry about it. Snap out of it. Candide thinks about this. Goes back to his little house, his little home, which he has set up a kind of mini utopia of sorts, with all of his friends around, Pangloss and Martin and Cacambo, and that's a whole other thing, and Cunigund and the old woman. They're all living there together. And Martin and Pangloss are arguing. You know, no, I'm right. No, this is right. Best of all possible. Worst of all possible words. Optimism, skepticism, blah, 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 blah. And Candide's listening to him. And the last line in the story is, "That is very well put," said Candide, "but we must cultivate our garden." Now think about that. Now, it's got a certain Zen-like quality to it, the simplicity of it, the just burying yourself in nature part of it, but it's not exactly that. It is a statement of humility, perhaps, because the whole world, and we have been all over the world at this point, you know, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, South America, and now we're like on the edge of Asia. Now his entire life, after bouncing around the world, now his entire life is just this one little home, this one little plot of land. And in fact, he narrows it even further and say, well, it's just the garden, just the garden. It's an easy metaphor to see that, okay, you know, you want to tend the garden and make it and make it flower. But it's also significantly, I think, it is a garden. It's not the woods. He is looking to cultivate. He's looking to take the little patch of nature that he has and organize it. Take what he can and make it better. This isn't about letting nature run wild. This isn't about going and losing yourself in the woods. The romantics are going to do that soon enough. He is saying, take the little nature that we have, human nature even, if you will, and try to make it better, cultivate it, organize it, structure it, discipline it, try to improve it, make it better. This is the Enlightenment. This is the belief, ultimately, in reason, in the power of reason. That if you just think about something and you apply organizational principles, if you apply discipline and a critical viewpoint, you can take something and make it better. Maybe not for everybody, maybe not the whole world, but just on a small scale, make it better. Cultivate your garden. This does come as a kind of cookie, fortune cookie tag at the end of this. I think Voltaire's personal role as an advisor to Enlightenment despots is significant here. Especially, he was a particularly great friend or advisor to Frederick of Prussia, who some critics will tell you is sort of, you get the Baron Thunder Ten Drunk is a stand-in for Frederick of Prussia. Slightly smaller scale, I believe. But his job, essentially, was as a whisperer to these great figures, and he's constantly writing letters to Russia, and he has a problem. He has a troubled relationship with France, but he's constantly writing letters to the great leaders around, trying to help them become benevolent dictators, essentially. And to do that, he needs to hone his message down to just a few simple steps and cultivate your garden. Worry about what is inside your borders, perhaps, is easy to see as political advice. You can interpret that as personal, you can interpret that as political, you interpret it as metaphysical if you want. But it is about making things better. The Enlightenment dream. Taking whatever you're given and doing your best with it. That's the Enlightenment.